Well, good morning, everyone. It's great to be up here and continuing to work through the Pentateuch. The Pentateuch is that's a Greek term meaning the 5 books. It's the first 5 books of the Bible. The ancient Hebrews called it the Torah, which means the law. Okay, so we've got some English, we've got some Greek, we've got some Hebrew, but basically what it means is that it's the first 5 books of the Bible. And so we've been working on this series on the Pentateuch for 1 year now. We've had 44 sermons on the Pentateuch, working through the books of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. We've seen and read through stories, we've read through poems, we've read through laws. And so I want to do today, before we get into Deuteronomy, the last of the 5 books, I want to kind of do a little bit of review over the first 4 books and kind of come together with a sense of what are the emphases that we need to have. All these various stories and all these laws and all these dynamics within these 4 books. It's a lot. It's a lot of material. So what do we need to be focusing on as we go into the book of Deuteronomy? So the book of Deuteronomy is literally just a series of sermons that Moses delivers before the second generation of people go into the promised land. So it's just a bunch of sermons. There's hardly any narrative at all. And so I want us to be thinking about what do we need to do before we go into this concluding book? What needs to be on our minds? And so I want to review this by working primarily through the storyline. So the Pentateuch is essentially the unfolding of a story, and there are 4 main sections. The 4 sections do not coincide with the 4 books that we have studied. So there are 4 big sections of text in what we have studied to this point. The first section, which is, you can think of it as a prologue to not just the Pentateuch, but it's really the prologue to the Bible. Genesis 1 through 11, the prologue to the Bible. So it's like the introductory material. And so we have the familiar stories. God creates the heavens and the earth. God creates humanity. We've got the story of man and woman in the garden and the eating of the tree from the knowledge of fruit of good, the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Which is in disobedience to God. And so there's this breaking of relationship with God and the breaking of relationship with themselves as human beings. And then these questions, the stories continue. We've got Cain and Abel. We've got Noah and his sons. We've got the Tower of Babel. And it ends by introducing us to the family of Abraham. So that's the prologue, but it puts forth questions and really answers the biblical perspective of timeless questions that all of humanity has been asking. Is there a God? How did the universe come into being? What is the purpose of humanity? Why are we here, both generally and individually? What does it mean to be male and female? We're still trying to figure out all of these questions. What does it mean to be husband and wife? What does it mean to be parents? Why is there so much division and conflict in the world? Why is there suffering and death? Is there hope for something positive in the future that would change all this? And how can we be a part of that hopeful vision? So these are questions that humanity has been asking for thousands of years, and the Bible raises those questions through these stories in its prologue. But regardless of the stories and all of these things, they all point to, and here in the prologue we have these stories and we have some poems, and they all point us to the promise that God makes to man and woman in the garden after they have rejected him. He says, woman, you are going to give birth to a man someday, and he's going to conquer death, and he's going to bring life to all things. And so that is the centering theme, okay, the centering focus that the author of the Pentateuch, Moses, really starts at the very beginning. So we can get lost in all the trees and all the stories and all the laws and all the poems. But if we stay focused on this promised man who's going to conquer death and bring life to all things, that helps us pull all of these things together. So it really begins pushing us into that direction. The second section is the rest of the book of Genesis, Genesis chapter 12 through 50. Okay, this is the history of the early patriarchs for the nation of Israel. And so at the end of the prologue, there's a genealogy that says, hey, this promised man is going to come through the family of Abraham. And so the rest of the book of Genesis is about Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, and Jacob and his 4 wives, which eventually they give birth to 12 sons, and these 12 sons become the 12 tribes of Israel. And it's in this story of Abraham and Sarah that we first get a glimpse of what it means to walk before God as an individual human being or as a family. The story of Abraham and Sarah. And we see God calling Abraham and Sarah to some very specific things. He calls them to walk blamelessly before him. Now, we've been using the term wholehearted or honest, but that is what God calls Abraham to. Walk wholeheartedly, walk blamelessly, walk honestly before me. And trust me. Trust me. And so God works. We don't see this influx of a lot of laws. We just see God working in a way that forces Abraham and Sarah to trust him. And it challenges their traditions of what it means to have a God. It challenges their religious traditions. And it challenges their traditions of what it means to be man and woman and as parents. And so they make all of these efforts that are consistent with their traditions when they were idolatrous, okay? And when women were more seen as a piece of property. And so God is beginning to train his people to walk before him in faith, and he is transforming their perspective of what it means to follow God and what it means to live as human beings on his earth. And this trust element is what forces them to reconsider their traditions. And so the story unfolds with Isaac and Rebekah, and then Jacob and his 12 sons and 4 wives. And we get to the story where God saves Israel by taking them to Egypt under the leadership of Joseph, one of the 12 sons. And the last story is this story between Joseph, who is second in control of the nation of Egypt, and Judah, an unlikely ambassador and speaker for his family because he had rejected and left his family earlier in his life. And so we see here at the end of the book of Genesis that Judah becomes an ambassador. Judah stands up for his father. Judah stands up for his family and his brothers. In the face of Egypt, it's actually his brother, and he didn't know it. But Judah really comes to the plate to defend the people of God and the purposes of God. And so we see at the end of the book of Genesis another song, another poem that says that this promised man that's going to conquer death and bring life to all creation and bring prosperity is going to come through the line of Judah. So those are the first 2 big sections. Genesis 1 through 11 is the prologue, Genesis 12 through 50, and it's still focusing on who is this man going to be? Who is this man from Israel going to be? It's going to bring prosperity and life to not only the nation of Israel, but to the nations of the world. And so we come to the third section, and that's the section we've been spending quite a bit of time in. I'm getting ahead of myself. The third section is the 15 chapters that describes God's deliverance of Israel from Egypt. And so Israel went to Egypt to be saved from the famine. God brought them there. They were there for 400 years, and so we're all very familiar with this story. And so the first 15 chapters is the story of God's deliverance of Israel from Egypt. Egypt had begun to murder the Israelite children. Egypt had enslaved Israel to harsh slavery and bitter, harsh treatment. And for what is probably 100 years, Israel cried out for deliverance from this harsh treatment. And so the story in this third section is God's deliverance through very miraculous ways, the 10 plagues that he brought upon Egypt, ending with the Passover. So the Passover is a tradition that God institutes, celebrating the passing over the firstborn of Israel by the angel of death, resulting in the killing of all of the firstborn of the nation of Egypt, which just left Egypt decimated and depressed and dejected and finally admitted defeat. So they released the Israelites. Pharaoh reconsiders and sends his armies after Israel leaves Egypt, and Israel is back up against the Red Sea, and Pharaoh's armies are approaching, and God finally wipes the armies of Pharaoh out at the Red Sea, and there's this huge song that the entire nation sings, celebrating the victory that God had over Pharaoh and Egypt in saving Israel and fulfilling his promise of bringing them out of that nation. And so that's, again, it ends with a song, all right, and celebrates that God is going to be king over the nations, not these earthly kings. And so finally we come into this fourth section. So 3 sections: the prologue, the beginning of Genesis 1 through 11, second section through the rest of Genesis, third section, the story of God's deliverance of Israel from Egypt, taking us through 15 chapters of Exodus. And then we come into the wilderness journey, which is Exodus 16 through Numbers 36. So it's a lot of material, 2.5 books. And there are really 2 main threads. So again, it's easy to get lost in the narrative and all of the laws, some of which don't seem to make any sense at all. And all of these rituals that God commands. But there's really 2 main threads that are happening from the storyline in this big section. The first one is the story of Israel's lack of faith in God's ongoing deliverance. The text over these 2.5 books, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, is really centered around these 10 times that Israel doesn't believe God that he will deliver them. And they grumble and they complain and they engage in sin and idolatry and sexual immorality. And so God finally says at the 10th time, you aren't going into the land. The next generation will. So they have to wander around in the wilderness for 40 years. So that's the first thread. This idea of their unwillingness to trust God for their care, which just then leads to disobedience and idolatry. The second big thread is the idea of God dwelling in their presence. God dwelling in their presence. So when we started the book in Genesis, God dwelt with man and woman in the garden. And when they sinned, it created this chasm. Created this chasm. And so what we see then is God increasingly wanting to dwell in the presence of humanity that he has created and that he loves. But humanity has this unwillingness to dwell in his presence because of their growing guilty consciences. So if you can remember, when God wanted to meet them at Mount Sinai, he came down and he had made these plans, and the nation of Israel was supposed to come and meet God, but they stood back and they kept going back, and they told Moses, we don't want to meet God. He's going to destroy us. You talk to God for us. So they wanted priests. They didn't want to be in the presence of God because their consciences were guilty. They had been unfaithful these 5 times, and God had corrected them and expressed his anger at them. And so in their guilty consciences, aware of their sin and unfaithfulness, they did not want to stand in God's presence. And so laws emerge then. And so we see this pattern growing. God delivers and says, follow me, I will care for you, take you into the promised land. So God initiates deliverance, but they don't fully believe and trust when things get hard. And so they turn to sin, putting their trust in other things to provide for what they need. And then that brings on law. Law identifies the sin and shows where we don't have faith. But the cycle continues. Their faithlessness grows, their sins grow, and the laws grow, which increases the number of transgressions that they sin against. So it's just this cycle. And each time they're further and further away from dwelling in God's presence, to the point where God will come and dwell with them, but not the entire nation, not as a community of God's people, but in a tent. And only one time a year can one person, the high priest, enter into the presence of God in the Holy of Holies in the tabernacle. That wasn't God's original plan. And so we have these two big threads in this wilderness journey. Their unfaithfulness in light of God's abundant deliverance and promises, and their really unwillingness to dwell in God's presence, even though God is longing to dwell in their presence. And oftentimes, and this is one of the corrections an accurate reading of the law brings to us. I mean, did some of you, when you were first introduced to the gospel, hear the story that, God exists, and there's this big chasm between us and God cannot dwell in the midst of sin. And so we needed Jesus Christ to deal with the sin. So that's true in a lot of ways. But the idea that God has this inability to dwell in the midst of sin is not correct. Jesus came and initiated, all right, dwelling amidst a bunch of sinners. All right, so it's not God's inability to dwell amongst sinners. That's not the problem. The inability that we have to stand in God's presence is because we don't believe and trust in Him. That's the issue. Our lack of belief in God is what leads us to sin. All right? That's what needs to be corrected. God is running after us to dwell in His presence. We just don't believe it. We just don't believe that He wants us. We don't believe that He's going to prosper us. We don't believe that He wants to make us happy. I mean, when He called Abraham and Sarah and their family, He said, I'm going to shower blessings and prosperity upon you. And the Jewish word for blessing is happiness. The beginning of the book of Psalms, the promise is that the person who walks with God and meditates on the law, the 5 books of Moses day and night, is one who will experience prosperity and happiness. That's what God is about. The challenge is, again, when things get tough in our lives because of the corruption of the world and our own sin, we don't believe it. We don't believe it. And so that's where the book of Numbers ends up. Again, the calling of God, which was initiated with Abraham and Sarah, walk blamelessly before me. And then He says, I'm going to raise you up, and you will be a family of nations. Your children will be amongst the nations, and they will be a people known for their pursuit of righteousness and pursuit of justice. So walk blamelessly before me and pursue righteousness and justice. And so what we see throughout the wilderness story is that Israel is really incapable of that. They're not in this honest relationship with God because of their guilty consciences. And they continue to be unrighteous and incapable of engaging in justice. So righteousness is this idea of when everything's right, when everything's good, when things are as God intended it to be, that's what righteousness means. It's without any problems, right? The pursuit of justice is recognizing that in a broken world with broken people, there are a lot of things that aren't right. There's a lot of unrighteousness. Justice is the pursuit and the living out of our lives with works that are trying to make things right. That's what justice is. That's what justice is. And that's what God has called his people to. And so this section ends with those 4 poems that are prophecies from Balaam. Remember the king Balak of Moab hired Balaam, this diviner, this seer, this prophet, he's a false prophet, to curse Israel. Instead, he pronounced 4 blessings. And they really all point to, once again, a king will emerge from Israel. He's going to judge the nations of the world, and Israel as the nation will reign over the earth in prosperity, not because of Israel, but because of its king, this promised child. And so again, throughout all these stories, the author continues to point us to put your hope and trust in the promises of God to bring life, which will eventually fully come into being through this promised child. So we're going to come into the book of Deuteronomy, and the nation is settled in the plains of Moab. Just a short distance away is the border to the promised land. Moses can't go over. Aaron has already died. The first generation, after 40 years, has all died off. So this is the children of that first generation. That's where they're at. Where are we at as readers? That's what we have to ask ourselves. Here's where Israel's at, but we've been reading through all this. Where are we as readers reading this ancient book? It's a book that's thousands of years old. What are all these old stories, these old poems, and these way out-of-date laws? What do they have to do with us? Well, it seems to me that there are at least 3 things that the text is really burdening us to consider. This is where our minds and our feelings, our affections, our hopes should be. 3 things. The first thing, Abraham and Sarah were prototypes. As they were called to walk blamelessly before God, we are called to walk blamelessly before God. That's the first one. The second one is, when God made his promises to Abraham and to Sarah, he said, you will be the father and the mother of many nations. And he says, your children, your generations are called to righteousness and justice. We are the children of Abraham and Sarah, Paul says in the New Testament. So we are called to walk blamelessly before God. We are called to pursue righteousness and justice as God's people. And the third thing is that what do we do with our sin when we're faced with the fact that we're not righteous and we're not always just? What do we do? So those are the 3 things. Walk blamelessly before God, pursue righteousness and justice, and what do we do when we see evil and unrighteousness in our own lives? So the first one, walk blameless before God, who promises happiness and prosperity. So this word again, blameless, we've been using the term wholehearted, and we were spending more time on it in the book of Genesis when we were working through that because it's used more there. But it really is this idea that has set a trajectory for all the Pentateuch. And I want to keep us in this idea. So again, the text uses the term blameless in Genesis chapter 17. And I think when we see the word blameless, we think, oh, perfect. God's calling us to be perfect. God's calling us to be without blame. God's calling us to have no wrong in our lives. That's not really what the word means. The word blameless originally has the idea of being honest or whole, okay? So God wants us to live our life honestly before Him or whole before Him, which essentially means He doesn't want us to be compartmentalized before Him. Like, God, I don't mind you knowing about this part of my life. And see, all this goes on in our consciences because God knows. He knows our actions, He knows our thoughts, He knows our feelings. But in our consciences, we actually think we can hide some things. And we're really deceiving ourselves All right, so God wants us to be whole, but we live a lot of our lives not wanting to be honest and whole with God. These things we're willing to admit, and all of us have been in these places. We wrestle with God, which is really in our own minds and in our own hearts. We wrestle. I'm not really sure if I'm ready to admit this about myself. And we're not honest with ourselves, and really what it is we're not being honest with God. We're not being honest with God. God calls us to this wholehearted honesty. And he promises happiness and prosperity. For those who put their trust in God, he promises happiness and prosperity. He doesn't promise to be without suffering. He just says, in the midst of suffering, happiness and prosperity is possible with me. We trust in his care rather than fearing his judgment. His judgment is real. We won't escape his judgment unless we trust in his care. If we don't trust in his care, we will face his judgment. That's the really interesting thing about God. He's the one that will judge, but he's also the one that will free us. You know? And so if we don't trust in his care, we're going to be judged, and we will experience his judgment. So God is calling us, trust in my care for you. Trust in my care for you. Live wholeheartedly before me. So that's the first thing. The second thing, pursue righteousness and justice as Abraham's children. Okay, so again, righteousness, this pursuit, this recognition that there is a defined good. There is a world where all things are right. I wouldn't say that the laws that we see throughout the books of Moses, in Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, and Deuteronomy is going to have a lot of laws. Those laws are not defining like the perfect world. Those laws are saying, here's where sin emerges in humanity, and here's some things that we need to do to curb it. All right? I would actually say that what Jesus is giving us in the teachings of the New Testament is the push towards righteousness. So the teachings about what it means to be an individual before God, life in the church, life in the family, life in the world, life as a worker, life as a citizen, these are the things that are beginning to define what it means to be Christ-like. Because Jesus calls us to be like him. The apostolic teaching throughout the New Testament calls us to be like Christ and to form Christ-likeness in us. That's what the New Testament says is happening, that God is doing through the Holy Spirit in us. He's shaping us into the image of our Creator, which we know from Colossians is Jesus. All right, so the image of righteousness is Jesus Christ. And the teachings in the New Testament are pressing us towards that. And when we see things in our lives that aren't right, we work justice, okay? When you sin against somebody and then confess it and ask that person to forgive you, that is a work of justice, all right? If you see sin in the life of another person that you love and care for, and you see them destroying their lives, and you go gently and lovingly confront them and say, hey, what can I saw you do this, what can I do to help? It's sin. I want you to be delivered from it. That's a work of justice. Husbands loving their wives and wives loving their husbands, those are efforts of righteousness. And when they don't do that well and seek to love and forgive and care for each other, those are works of justice. And so righteousness and justice are things that's what the New Testament is calling us to. And that's what we're called to do. Walk blamelessly before God as individuals, and then to live righteous and just lives. There's a recognition that sin is going to occur. God has never been deceived to think that we as human beings could be perfect. That's never been his expectation. Right? It's not what he's expecting now. And so for me, it's helpful for me to divide these righteousness ideals up into 4 categories. I'm an individual. I have responsibilities as an individual. I'm a member of a family. I have responsibilities as a member of a family, and our family has responsibilities to the church and to the individuals within the family and to the world. And those are the other two categories. So individual, family, church, and world. That's how I see my life. Each one is supporting the other. And when there's a weakness in one that minimizes the strength that we can engage the others, that's what needs the focus at the time. Sometimes as an individual, I'm really strong and I can work hard in my family and hard in the church and hard in the world. Sometimes there are seasons when I'm weak, and that's when I took a 6-week sabbatical. Or there's some things I need to focus on or pray on or confess and bring some team of people around me. You see what I'm saying? So we don't have like this ordered list of priorities. It's recognition that God has called us to all these spheres. They mutually support one another. And where one is weak, that's when I know what I've got to focus on at the time. Because if one is not present, it's going to affect the other three: individual, family, church, and world. I see kind of the New Testament dividing things out as well like that in the letters. So those are the first two. Walk blamelessly before God. Second, pursue justice and righteousness. And the third thing, like I said, what do we do when we're confronted with the reality that we're not just, we're not righteous? See, and it's at that moment, because it's at that moment where we have to decide, am I going to walk wholeheartedly before God or not? Am I going to hide this? Am I not going to confess it? See, because what happens is when we're confronted with our sin, I think all of us experience, guilt and shame, fear. What happens if somebody finds out about this? What happens if my family knows, or the church knows, or whatever, my friends? So we experience those feelings: guilt for sinning, shame, I'm embarrassed. Our sense of self has been undercut. Our sense of who we are, and because we want to be a good person. That's a part of what forms our identity. Am I a good person? Another part of our sense of identity is, do other people think well of me? That's dignity and honor. Those are essential parts of what shape our identities, and we can't get away from it. Am I a good person? Do other people think I'm a good person? Well, when we see sin in our lives, those two things are attacked. No, I'm not a good person. And two, if people knew, they would think that I'm not a good person either. All right? That's what we all go through those feelings. So what do we do when we have those feelings? And there are really two options, which is why I forgot to have a reader this morning. The Galatians passage is in the text. So Paul says, if we rely on works of God, if we rely on works of law, we are cursed. If we rely on works of law, we are cursed. So this phrase, works of law, means things that we do according to a standard that has been set. So God has standards in the New Testament that He has set that define righteousness. But we also, a lot of us, every single one of us, also establish other standards, right, that would define for us what it means to be a good person and for other people to think good of us. And you know what kind of laws that you create for yourself, right? We all have a lot of rules and standards that we would like to see ourselves meet that you can't find anywhere in the Bible, Could be what you eat or what time you get up or how many hours you work. I mean, you name it. We all have these ideas of what it means to be a good person in our own eyes. If we rely on our ability to meet those standards, we are cursed. We are cursed. We won't have life. We won't have blessing. We won't have prosperity. We won't have happiness. And so it's in those moments of when we are confronted with our sin, and we feel guilty, and we feel shame, and then we feel fear. I'm no longer a good person. People aren't going to think well of me. What do we do at that moment? Do we continue to walk wholeheartedly before God in honesty? Oh, God, I see this in myself, and it is not good. It is not righteous. It is not just. Can we do that? Or do we fear God and run away from Him, eventually running away from God totally, because we don't want to acknowledge the fact that we are under Him? He is our Creator. He will judge us. Eventually we become unbelievers if we continue to do that, because we do not want to walk wholeheartedly before God and acknowledge that we are accountable to Him, because He created us. Or we can walk wholeheartedly. And we're able to do that for one reason. For one reason. And it's not something that ancient Israel had full knowledge and understanding of at the time. God provided Jesus Christ to cleanse our consciences. God provided Jesus Christ to cleanse our consciences. So we can stand wholeheartedly before God because God has done something through Jesus Christ to address these two issues, but a lot more. I am not a good person, and other people are not going to think that I'm a good person. And see, so Jesus Christ was the faithful Israelite. He walked before God in total honesty. He pursued righteousness and justice fully. And then Jesus Christ died. Okay? So he experienced the consequence of sin. He didn't sin, but he experienced the consequence of sin. And in experience of consequence of sin, he took on our fate. Our fate is death. We're no different than ancient Israel without Jesus Christ. We would, without clear consciences, without our guilt and shame erased, we would be running away from God at Mount Sinai just like Israel ran away from God at Mount Sinai. We can't stand before Him because He will destroy us, or we believe that He's going to destroy us. That's what we believe. But God says, no, I will send a Son. He's going to die to stand in the place that you deserve. Because where you are going deserves death. That's where you're headed. So Jesus Christ will take on death. And in His taking on of death, He offers His life. He'll take our death. We can take His life. And so what that does is that Paul teaches, and the Pentateuch teaches, God gives us His righteousness. It says, Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. Genesis chapter 15. It's the gospel. Belief in God's care and love and forgiveness is what brings about righteousness in us. And so, by our own means, no, we cannot be righteous. We are not good people. People shouldn't think that we're good people, but that's what we want. One of the big factors in our politics today is identity and personal dignity. Everybody wants their lifestyle to be accepted, and we want it backed up by law because we want everybody to accept us. What God does through Jesus Christ is says, because you have believed and trusted in my care for you, I will give you Jesus Christ's righteousness. That's the gospel. I will make you a righteous person. It's the declaration of righteousness, Romans chapter 3. Just like God says, I credited to Abraham righteousness because of his faith, we are credited with the righteousness of Jesus Christ because of our faith. Okay, so I am a good person. And others, they can think what they want of me. But God says that I'm a good person. And as I live in this wholehearted faith before God, We will follow in the life of Christ where it says, as Jesus grew and matured, he grew in his reputation between both God and man. We will live righteous lives that people will acknowledge, hey, that is a good person. And we say, well, that's not because of me. It's because of what Jesus Christ has done in me. And that takes faith. And so that's the message of the gospel for us to, quote, get saved. But it's also the message for all of us, because all of us who have believed in the gospel have situations in our lives all the time where we either sin or are sinned against that produce guilt and shame and fear. And the temptation is to hide it. And if we're hiding it from people, let me tell you, you're hiding it from God. Because it's not something that you're willing to be honest about. In reality, in the flesh, which means that you haven't come to the point of acknowledging the reality of it between you and the Lord in a real honest way. And you're deceiving yourself. We as Christians can do that. That's why the overarching theme in the New Testament in terms of what it means to follow God is to walk by faith. Faith in what? Faith in God's gift of righteousness to us as people through Jesus Christ. We have to, day by day, live in the righteousness of Jesus Christ for us. If we don't, we're going to run away and hide from God and from each other and rely on our works for the rest of our lives. Even though when we got saved, we says, I know it's not by my works, Jesus. But it's so deceptive. When Martin Luther said, every day of the Christian life is repenting from this desire to rely on our own works. Let me pray. Lord God, thank you for the Pentateuch and its clarity around the gospel. Clarity around the hope that we have in the promised man, who we now know to be Jesus Christ, that he took on our sin and death and guilty consciences so that we could have his freedom, his life, his blessing, his joy. In your son's name we pray. Amen.